Hey everyone. So today I'll be going over a game between Akiba Rubinstein and uh, Efim Bogoljubov. I hope I'm saying his name right. So we'll just hop straight into it. So the game went with d4 and d5. By the way, I should mention that Rubinstein in this tournament scored a stunning 11.5 out of 14. Now, the people in this tournament at the time were people like Tarash or Alakine. Um, Really strong players, and he scored first in the tournament, and this game got a brilliancy prize. So, white played c4 here, standard stuff. c6, black top for a Slav. e3, knight f6, this is all very normal so far. And now g6. Personally, I think white has pretty good results against this kind of setup for black. Because this bishop actually is not often in play. In positions like the Grunfeld, you'd often see a quick c5, which would target the center, and the bishop on g7 actually serves a purpose. In this case, the pawn is on c6, so that's a little bit different. So the bishop on g7, I believe, has a lot less value in this kind of position. So, knight f3, normal development, bishop g7, bishop e2, castles, knight bd7, and here we get a really normal position. This position has been seen a ton of times. In 2017, there was a game between Svidler and Jobava here. So white can now take on d5. This is really important because if the pawn were on e6 already, then black can take with the e pawn, and that would be a very different structure than what happened in the game. In this case, black is forced to take with the knight or the c-pawn. Now, if black takes with the c-pawn, which looks really logical, basically queen b3 will happen, bishop d2, the rooks will come to the center, and actually black is struggling to untangle himself with these two knights. He could try to put them on e4, they might get exchanged off, d5 is always very weak, and if there's a knight on b6, then a move like a4, a5 comes, and black just doesn't have a comfortable game. So that is why in this position, instead, knight takes d5 was played. White took, and now takes. And again, you get a very similar position, but at least in this case, black has successfully removed one of his knights, which is a good thing because black doesn't have a lot of space to maneuver his pieces, so the more pieces he exchanges off, the easier it is for black to play. So queen b3 was played. This is just targeting the b7 pawn, but also looking at d5. And here black has an option. It's how does he reroute this knight? This is the problem piece. Blocks the queen, blocks the bishop. It's a little awkwardly placed. So here black played knight f6. This was criticized, but I think really no matter what black does here, he's going to be a little bit worse. Again, you can see how like all the play is going to happen on the queen side. The bishop will come out this way, the rooks will pile up on the c-file, and this bishop will have no purpose because black can't get in a successful e5. So this is the problem piece for black's position. So where does black move the knight? Well, people suggest him moving the knight to b8, which isn't a bad idea. It's to reroute it to c6, but I'm pretty sure in 1922, when this tournament was played, that people were not going to go backwards and then reroute the knight to some a slightly better position just to do this. That's a joke, obviously. Maybe he would have done it, but he played the more natural knight f6. Again, knight b6 would just run into a4, a5. So knight f6, bishop d2, developing basically the last piece that needs to be developed. The rooks are connected, all the pieces are out, white's queen looks good. And you can see how there are no weaknesses in white's position at all. There's nothing wrong with white's position. Knight e4 was played. Again, a very natural move. Black would love to play a move like bishop f5. This would be the idea. Besides the b7 pawn hanging, I mean, you might not want to take that because maybe rook b8 is a lot. But white can just simply play a move like rook fc1, rook ae1, and pile up on the c-file. And actually, this light-squared bishop is just not that good, and there's still a weakness on b7. And this is not a very simple position to play. I mean, if you play something like b6, suddenly like bishop a6 comes in, and the c-file is forever dominated. It might be good to actually bring this bishop back to exchange it off. Just a very uncomfortable position for black to play. It's not easy to develop naturally. And black always has to keep an eye on this b7 pawn because it is hanging, and white is ready to now try to play bishop b4. So knight e4, and now rook d1. Bishop e4 was possible, but I think this gets a little bit complicated because now black can play a5, and if the bishop wants to stay on his diagonal, white has to deal with a4, something like, let's say, this, knight d6, queen c5, and this is still better for white, but it's a little harder to play. I don't think it's so straightforward. Maybe the bishop can come out, maybe e6 can be played, maybe the bishop can come out to f5, maybe the rook can try to challenge the queen. This is not so clear, especially because this bishop is also, you could argue it's not placed in the best way. So actually, I think his decision to exchange his bishop off was better than playing bishop e4, objectively. Rook takes knight, and now queen d6. I don't really understand queen d6. I think the idea was to play e5. A more logical move, although it looks really passive, is to play something like rook b8, just to cover this pawn. Not b6, just because you don't want to create a weakness yet, and maybe you can play bishop f5 at some point. Maybe you can play a6, b5, maybe you can try something. I thought this was a reasonable way to play, and for example, like rook c1, preparing rook c2, bishop f5 prevents that for the moment, but rook c5 is a good way to go, just attacking the d-pawn, and if you defend it with e6, okay, well now the bishop is locked out of the queen side. You could exchange this off quickly, and then bring the other rook into the game, and white has really good control here. He has the entire c-file. This cannot be contested easily. If you try this, it looks really ideal, but now queen c2, and again, white just has good control over the c-file. And you really don't want to play rook takes c5, because after rook takes c5, rook c7 is coming. So inevitably, white just gets full control of the queen of the c-file, and possibly the queen side. A3, b4, maybe a4, b5 is coming. The queen's going to enter the game via c5. And black just has no way to actually contest white on the c-file. So inevitably, the c-file is going to be under white's control, no matter what black does. So queen d6, rook c1, very logical. Notice how when the knight took the bishop, it actually improved this rook, because white would want to play rook d2 at some point anyways, to put it on c2. So it just saved white a move. b6, black finally admits that this is a weakness, and he just wants to push the pawn just to prevent it from being taken at some point. This bishop does badly need to develop. Rook dc2, again, very logical, just piling up the rooks on the c-file. Bishop b7, also a very logical move. He could have played bishop f5 here. This is totally reasonable. I think he just didn't like the idea of rook c6. And this is not so clear. But actually, there's an interesting tactic here, which is rook ac8. Now, the point is if you take this, and this can be taken, and after bishop f1, e takes d6, and bishop d3 might become a problem, and actually, this pin is really annoying. The rook will come to c8, and you could even argue black is just winning in that position. So, that was one way to play. Bishop b7, okay. I still don't think this is a good square for the bishop, because this pawn is not going anywhere. You can't push this pawn. And again, e5 is really not possible. And here, White's move is just really important. I think a lot of people would try to cash in with rook c7. Or play something else, like bishop b5, or, like maybe they would try to reroute the knight somewhere. I think the way he handled this was excellent. He played here queen a4, which is an excellent move. Because black's only threat is to play rook c8 at some point. So the idea is that if I put my queen on a4, at least I'm keeping an eye on the a7 pawn. Now, the other idea is that, okay, if black were to try to exchange things with rook fc8, let's say, well, this loses instantly. Because after takes, let's say if rook takes, then you can actually just, you could take this, and then queen e8 comes at the very end. Sorry about that. And you win the bishop. So white will just be a piece up. So black cannot exchange this. And if you try something like bishop takes instead, well then queen e8 anyways. And again, this piece is lost. So there's really no good way for black to contest white on the c-file. And that's the point of queen a4, is that it looks at the e8 square, but also looks at a7. For example, bringing the other rook here, this can just be taken now. And this bishop is hanging. So it's really not easy for black to make a move here. Now, black here played a6. a5 might have been better, but again, this is hard to see. I mean, after something like a3, you have to contest with the ideas of b4, and you also gave up the b5 square for this bishop, and, you know, if white can somehow gain control over this b5 square completely, and then control over c7, black should just be losing. There's no way that black can, you know, deal with this backwards b pawn and a rook on c7. It'll just be too much for black to handle. So it's hard to really accept that move. But a6, okay, that makes sense. In some cases, you want to play b5 here. But again, the way he handled this was excellent. Rook c7, very quick to just get on the 7th rank and just not, you know, give black any time to react. The bishop is hit, so this has to do, like, black has to do something about this. So he counterattacks with b5, and now, very simple move, queen a5. Just keeping control of the c7 square. And also, in some cases, you never know, you might threaten to come in via b6 if this queen moves. So rook a, b8, it's really hard to suggest a good move here. I mean, if you really try to exchange things here, then white can just play rook c5. And this is very strong. And after something like this, bishop a8, for example, which looks like a horrible move. I mean, if you have to play bishop a8, it's pretty bad. One of the top stockfish moves is bishop c8, but this is basically conceding that something went wrong here, and this is a very difficult position for black to defend. I mean, white can just play queen c3 and start threatening, you know, taking on c8. And white has complete control of the c-file. Really hard to contest this. So instead of this bishop a8, for example, and then if rook, you know, you play rook a7, rook c8, you could just take on a6, because after rook c1, there's this very nice move. After, let's say, bishop c6, you have to get the bishop out of there. Queen d2, and the rook is gone. You could play rook a1, but now queen c2, and the bishop on c6 is gone. Very nice trap here. And again, white was attacking the bishop and the queen. So going back to this position, queen a5, I know I'm looking at a lot, but it makes sense to just show why rook c8 is not working. Rook a b8 instead, holding the bishop. Rook c5, again, very logical. Just cutting off the queen from ever leaving anywhere, but also keeping an eye on this pawn. And locking in these rooks. And black can just do nothing here. And this just shows how useless this bishop is. It's doing absolutely nothing in this game. You would really want the bishop somewhere on the queen side. Like, you would probably rather have the bishop on e7. You know, at least in that way, the bishops can contest these dark squares. But anyways, rook fd8 was played. I mean, again, it's hard to suggest a good move here. Knight e5, very strong move. Now, this cannot be taken. It looks like, oh, why can't I just take this? But actually, this loses because there's a double attack here. The queen is hit. The rook basically is untouchable. Here, let me show you. Like this, and that's it. King g7, just rook c8. And these are very, very nasty threats. And there's nothing on the back rank. So that's why this cannot be taken. So bishop f6 was tried instead. Again, it's really hard to suggest a move here. I mean, Stockfish recommends rook e8. I mean, it avoids knight c6, but this is such a strange move to make, and white is still completely winning here. So knight e5, bishop f6, now knight c6, just forking the rooks. This cannot be taken because after this, the queen is trapped completely. All the squares are gone. There's nothing that black can do here. So this cannot be taken. This knight is completely poisoned. And here, black played e6 to give his queen some luft. He wants to go queen f8 at some point. Really the only way to make a good escape route for the queen. G3 is an excellent move. I mean, how many of us would just cash in and just take the rook? Taking this one, okay, well now the bishop takes, and this is a skewer. But taking this one, I mean, how many of us would do that and, just sit with this position? But he decided to play G3 first, which is just an excellent move. I mean, there's no way to actually even still take this knight. You could take it, but after this, Queen F8, A6 falls. And this is weak. And white still has complete control here. There's nothing black can do. This bishop is just so out of play. This bishop is actually doing something. Now, why is G3 another reason for G3 being such a good move is that King G2 is possible. There are no back rank tricks. And these are all light squares. This is a dark squared bishop, so there's no way to actually touch the king. Rook DC8 was tried. If this, you can take this now. This is a bit different, because obviously if bishop takes, you could just take on C8. This is a pin, and there's no way to save this bishop. So rook DC8 takes, and now bishop B5. This is a very strong move. It's the strongest move. It's really the only way for white to completely decisively kill black in this position. Now this cannot be taken because of a move like Queen A7 that hits the rook, hits the bishop, and what's a good move here? Queen D8. You can just take this, and Rook C8 is coming, Rook C7 is coming, B5 is falling. These two pawns are going to be passed, and this bishop is still useless. It is completely locked out by white's pawns. So bishop B5, really strong move. Bishop D8 was tried, skewering. Bishop E8, strong move, just targeting F7. If this is taken, you can just play this, and this is a winning endgame. Basically, these two pawns are very strong. The rook is still in the 7th rank. This rook doesn't have any good targets. If he goes rook c8, you can go rook b6 to start attacking this guy. And if you try rook c2 here, white can just slowly improve his position, playing moves like king g2, g4, h4, and start counterplaying the king side. And this rook is basically tied down to holding the b pawn, and this pawn is still very weak. So it should be a winning endgame for white. Does take some technique, would take some time to win, but should be winning. Instead, queen f8, and now this is taken, and he sacked his queen. Well, he said in his own words that this wasn't really a queen sack. It was more like just winning material that was worth more than the queen. And he's completely right. The two rooks are dominating, and this king and queen are very poorly placed. There's no way to actually get this king to safety. This bishop is, again, doing nothing. This king, look at the contrast of these kings. The king on g1, no pieces, no weaknesses. There's nothing touching him. The king on g8, he's in trouble. Queen d6 was tried. Rook b7. I mean, how many of us would look for some discovered check here? It doesn't work. Rook b7 is a much better move. Threatening bishop takes f7. Bishop b6, this just blunders. Rook c6 and bishop f7, and then the bishop on b6 will fall. And there's really no good perpetual because, again, this queen is on a dark square, and all these pawns are dark squared pawns. And there's just no good perpetual here, and nothing good for black. So what a game, but some key moments here to just, keep in mind. In the opening, in this setup, after knight bd7, white had this chance to exchange on d5. Very vital to remember that, white wants to open the c-file. And if he can do that, he has succeeded. And then playing queen b3. No developing moves, just queen b3, immediately targeting d5 and b7. And I think this was the start of black's problems. All the way from the opening. I think his opening choice was just bad. And then choosing to exchange off his bishop instead of going for complicated games with bishop b4. That's another really good instructive moment. Just giving this up, basically buying himself a move to play rook c2 at some point, and just the development here is very logical. Another key moment in the game, queen a4, very vital to keep an eye on the a7 pawn, but also keep an eye on the back rank. Really good move. And then playing rook c5. This is just excellent technique. Basically locking in this queen, preparing a lot of tricks. I mean, black's position here is a lot worse. He cannot do anything here. I mean, he treated this guy, who's probably a very strong grandmaster, as a kid. Like, black could not do anything here. It reminds me of like Bobby Fischer games, where it seems like Fischer just makes the correct moves, and his opponents don't even have like a chance to actually make any serious mistake. Black just went worse here from the opening. And then playing this move g3. I mean, this takes a lot of caution and a lot of patience to do. Not even cashing in, just realizing that this knight is untouchable. That's very good understanding. Yeah, and then finding bishop b5. All around a perfect game. Yeah, I mean, what can I say? Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this game. I will be back for more. All right, bye.